had a little conversation about Downeast boats. And this one, for this hour, is kind of about Grand Banks. I guess that's why you came. Well, so the story really is about the Downeast boats and how the Downeast boat became Grand Banks. Or where did the Grand Banks really come from and why? Okay, so in the beginning, we have a bunch of people that wear hats like this, and they go out and get lobsters. And that's what this is. This is your basic New England lobster boat. It's designed, and hundreds were built by Jarvis Newman. And this boat, the development of this particular boat is the original Hinckley-Pickett boat. And that original Hinckley-Pickett boat lives in a slip across the harbor here. And then Hinckley realized that they needed a faster boat than a classic Downeaster, and they went to a high-powered version of the Pickett boat. But this boat was also built by this company over here, Grand Banks, for a short period of time. But what they did was they realized to get the volumes for the interiors, to get the layouts that people like, that they needed to have more shape, more squares, more geometric combinations that would give them layouts that would give you a down galley, an actual shower, a stall shower in the head. This layout here gives you a separate shower stall. These boats can't give you that because they're too narrow. So the classic layouts that Grand Banks developed that propelled the Grand Banks to very high production rates and very high quality rates in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 50 years. And that basically is my career in helping design, manufacture, import, distribute Grand Banks. I was a dealer from 1972 to 2000. Just before 2008, I saw the signs of a recession, decided, slow down, wait. But the fact is, this has been a very, very successful product. And it's successful because it's comfortable. And it's a very easy boat to take care of. It has been built with excellent materials, and it lasts. And I know that when I first came in here today and parked my car, I can see one of the boats right over here. Somebody's got it with the white window screens, and that boat was probably built in the 80s, just by looking at it. You know, it might have been built in the 70s, but it's, 40 years old. How long is it going to be around? It's going to be around as long as it's taken care of. So I knew this back in the 70s, that these boats were going to last. I knew it because of my background in engineering, my background in boating, selling these things, that these boats would be around a long time. And so what I've done, as I've sold them, and we did very well, is I invested in 2 facilities to take care of them and store them and maintain them for people. care of boats today that are 50 years old, fiberglass boats. And basically they're in such shape that they can keep going. I don't see the clue, the smart things to do to get a boat to last a long time. Take it out of the water. Don't keep it in the water any more time than you need to. The second thing to do is get it out of the sun. Get the UVs off of it. You have on this boat fiberglass, it needs wax. If you don't wax it, the UV will break down the gel. You have a teak deck. The teak deck needs to be protected from the sun, or the sun will break down the fibers in the deck as the deck gets dry. If the deck is in salt water, there's a high salt content, just the atmosphere will penetrate the deck, and it loves it because it's then salt treated good. The deck can last us. We see the decks on the average Grand Banks lasting 40 years, an incredible length of time. But they don't last much longer than that. Most of them can easily go 30. Many of them in Florida can maybe go 20. Florida is very harsh on these types of things. Sure. And on these boats you have canvas and you have glass. The UV rays break down, they literally breaks down the glass. How do you protect it? Put a cover on it. How do you protect the teeth or the capra? Keep up the varnish, put a cover on it. How do you protect the fiberglass? Keep waxing. How about if you want to just protect the whole stupid boat? Well, take it out of the water and put it in a building when you're not using it. You save more money by doing that than you can imagine. Because once this fiberglass gets broken down a little bit after 30, 40 years, you have to paint it. Okay, so it costs more money to paint the superstructure than storing the boat in a building for years. So that's basically it. So it's a boat, the Grand Banks is a boat that can last a very long time. So it's now 8 minutes after 1. We had a great discussion here about how this design over here, how the designer of that boat is related to the designer of this boat and that boat and that boat. And they're all related because they're North American craft, and most of these designers have been to really excellent schools like MIT, Harvard, various really good architectural schools. Jarvis Newman, who designed this and this, degree in aeronautical engineering. This boat was essentially designed by a designer who named Kenneth Smith. Kenneth Smith designed the Grand Banks, and he was a brilliant architect. And he designed 2 boats for Grand Banks. One like this one over here in the 60s, and a Grand Banks 36. 2 of them. Gave him 2 36-footers to choose from, which one they were going to build. And so the 2 designs, one was built in Hong Kong, one was built in New England. They took these 2 boats back in the 60s and 70s, early. Well, I don't think much more than about 1970, because then they were committed probably. But in the 60s, they took them to put them in boat shows. They put them in boat shows in the East Coast and the West Coast, both of these boats in the same boat show, to see what the people would do, whether they liked the pure Downeast design or they wanted this design. But they're both about Downeast boats because this boat is descended from the traditional North American craft, which is the skipjack. It's descended from that because of the chines and the shape of the bow. And if you study the book from Howard Chappell, who's a Smithsonian naval architect who's in charge of all their work, he's retired now, he wrote this book, North American Craft. And he describes all this stuff. So Kenneth Smith borrowed this North American book from Howard Chappell and made this design because it was conducive for production. And as a result, in the 32-foot size, they built 1,000 of them. Stunning number. No trawler boat company in the world other than Grand Banks built 1,000 boats. Except Grand Banks, they built the 36. How many of those? Another 1,000. And these are the most expensive trawlers made. They still built 1,000 of the 36-footers. And when it came to this model of 42, how many they built? 1,550. So now we're talking about 3,500 boats. And we're getting to the 46. They built 350. So now we're talking about 4,000 boats. And then they built a 49. They only built about 150. Well, about 200 of those with 52s. The 49 52 is about 200. And so we're 4,200. We're kind of running out of gas, right? But of those 4,200 boats, 70% of them are on the East Coast of the United States. That means that between Florida and Maine, there's 3,000 Grand Banks. So what did Grand Banks do? They decided, well, maybe we need another model. Well, that was smart. So they went back to the Downeast style with this boat. And this boat was designed by a person named John Decknatell and C. Raymond Hunt. And Raymond Hunt's known because he designed the very first Bertram. And that boat was famous because they took the lines from another popular American craft, the North Carolina fish boat. The North Carolina fish boat has a lot of flare up at the back. And why? Because when you're pounding through the waves to go fishing, you better have a lot of flare, or when you go down the back of a wave and you try to come up another wave, if you don't have enough lift because of that flare and that bow, you're going to go under. So that's where this boat came from, and it's called the East Bay. So with the East Bay Grand Banks built in the 38 size, 150, they built a tenth of the number of the 36, so 42. And in the 43 size, they built 150, so that's 300. And in the 47 size, they built about 50, 350. And in the 49, 54 size, they built 150. So they built 500 of these. Okay, this boat's got 500. So they built in total over 4,500 boats. And so what I do is I don't sell these anymore because they don't build this model. And they don't build this model. What they're building now is a boat called the Palm Beach. And it's an ultra high-end picnic boat. They're doing the same thing with Hinckley. Hinckley and Palm Beach are on the same market. Because their clientele can afford to buy boats today. The boats are so expensive. The high quality boats.
John, Where does the illusion fit in this whole time frame?
Okay, so what happened here is that we have this book that I showed you. What did I do
I
with
think
it?
it's right over there.
We have this book here written by Tony Fleming. Tony Fleming is the father of the boat known as the Fleming. The Fleming is designed by Bob Doris from LA. Bob Doris also designed a line of boats for Grand Banks when it was called American Marine. Boats that were built in Hong Kong out of wood. Bob Doris improved on the design that Grand Banks got from Art de Fever. Started with a 46-footer. So this guy, Tony Fleming, read the book, Riding the Tide, Art, Engineering, and a Thirst for Adventure. That's a really good book to read. You could really learn about it. So that whole type of boat had been a product of Grand Banks. In 1985, during a boardroom management disagreement between the top executives and the board members of Grand Banks, Tony Fleming was the odd man out. It wasn't his fault. He was elected to become the new CEO. But the CEO who was in there, Bob Livingston, managed to convince people he would change his ways. The bottom line was, at the end of the day, one of the board members relented, let Bob back in, and Tony was their production manager. Big mistake letting that guy go. Because when he went, then Bob had to buy Tony out of his stock. So Tony had 12.5% of the stock of his publicly traded company. Bob had 12.5%. Ron Filbert, the CPA, had 12.5%. Dick Lowe had 12%. Altogether, they had 49%, and the holding company had the other 51%. And they hadn't finished paying off the holding company from the losses back in the 70s, so Tony sold his stock cheap to Bob. You might say Bob pushed Tony out. Either way you want to read it, it's in that book. So, what happened? Tony Fleming, they let him build himself a boat, 42 Grand Banks, and take it, and the plans from Bob Doris to the Alaska. Tony took the boat, sold the boat, went to Hong Kong with the plans, and now you have this incredible success story about Tony. Now, so back in Singapore, you've got those guys still working, and in the late 80s, they paid off all those banks. They went public. Stock sells for a bunch of dough. Now they've got 50 million in the bank. And they're watching Tony eat their lunch. Do you think that went well with Bob? Hell no. He didn't think that was very good at all. He was upset that he let Tony get away with those plans. So what did he do? He decided that he was going to build a big boat. So they hired a naval architect to design him a big Grand Banks. See, Bob didn't quite understand the lure of the round boat, round bilge boat like that boat. This simple little boat over here has these rounded bilges, and it's very gentle and bumpy wood. When you build a round bilge boat like this, it's and wide like this, to get these layouts like you can get out of that boat, you get a boat that can cruise at 18 knots. But is it going to be comfortable in a blow when you're making 8, 9 knots and you're going to Alaska or you're going up to the Pacific Northwest? Hell no. It's this. This is where the fishermen get, because they know they can survive. So Bob made the mistake of believing that he could just build a bigger Grand Banks for this market, and it would fly. And why was he encouraged to do this? He was encouraged to do it by guys like me and his sales manager, who could see in 1985 that it's just a couple more years that we're going to have another badass recession, because the government and the banks and the savings and loans were all at each other's throats, so it's going to happen. So the idea was to build a bigger boat and get above the probability of a financial panic with people who could afford to buy it. That's what we did, except two things happened. First is, it was built on this basic hull shape, 58-foot Grand Banks, which are actually 65 feet overall. Grand Banks built hull number 1 for themselves. I built hull number 2 for myself. Guess what happened? Congress, 1980. The boats came out in 89, 90, 1990. Summer of 90. Never forget that. Labor Day weekend. I was on the Cedar Point race with Jimmy Alsop, a couple other people. There was a young woman who was a lawyer from DC. And she's talking about what had just happened the day before, when the Joint Committee on Taxation had made up their minds to tax the rich people and put a 10% luxury tax on boats. I couldn't believe what she's saying. But they did. And that killed the boat industry right there. One thing about people who can afford to buy boats, they're not interested in paying any more taxes. And they can wait to buy the new boat. Which is exactly what all the Americans did. And it put all the boat builders out of business. So the 58-foot Grand Banks got shafted in the process, right? Exactly. So then we go in throughout the 90s. And we go into the 90s when Grand Banks decided to build this boat, the East Bay. So they had terrific success with the East Bay. And then we get into the 2000s. And they're watching Tony eat their lunch every day. And so Bob this time decides, okay, this time we're going to try something else. He's already got one failure with 58. Now he's going to try something else. So what does he try? At least he's smart this time. He hires Sparkman and Stevens, who is a very well-known naval architecture firm, for design. And the president of the Sparkman Stevens at the time, his name is Mitch Neff. And Mitch is a wonderful guy. He's from a really great boating family, well-known people, very experienced, very well educated. He's looking at the Fleming and how the Fleming's eating Grand Banks' lunch. He makes sure that his architects design a Fleming dealer. Anything that was wrong with the Fleming, they fixed with this new S&S design. So one day in early 2000s, I go to Singapore and I see Bob, and we sit in front of his desk, and I bought on that particular day 7 50-foot East Bays. Gave him order deposits from me on unsold 7 of these. And he decides to confess a little bit to me about what they were doing. He pushes this design across the desk. It's magnificent. It's the prettiest boat design I've ever seen. I said, Bob, that's going to really go. That's going to be, you've done something right this time. when can you start, and what are the deposits? And that's when he broke my heart. He said, John, we're not going to build it. I said, why? He said, because we're going to build this. He pushes his other design across it. Now, Bob, what was Bob thinking when he came up with the illusion? He was thinking that he was Jack Hargrave. Jack Hargrave was the famous designer who designed the bigger Harrises. And every time Bob would go to South Florida and he'd look at all those big Harrises, he would drool. You could imagine. He's got this production facility in Singapore. He's got billions of people to draw from for labor. He's got this new facility in Malaysia. He's got all the things going for him. He's got the reputation for good quality. He just doesn't have the right vehicle. So he thinks in his real great huge mind that Hargrave designed. I'm going to build Harris's. So he shows me this Hargrave design. I said, Bob, I don't think that's going to work. I said, it'll work. I said, good. I said, what are the designs? He said, so you don't need to give us deposits. We're just, we'll put you on the list. Well, I've learned a long time ago, if a boat builder doesn't want a deposit, that means he doesn't have any money right now. He's got no risk. If he wants deposits, that means he knows he can get money. So he went to the stage where he was ready to commit. I said, well, Hargrave's never going to design a boat for you. He said, no, but there are other designers who will. That's the illusion. So then they got this illusion. Now, the illusion was actually designed, Joe, by the same designer who designed the Midnight Lace. You know the Midnight Lace? Judge North has a Midnight Lace. That is Midnight Lace hull number 1. And that guy is a very well-known designer, but he's still more a Hargrave designer than the classic S&S design that Mitch had given us. So in order to come up with a name for the boat, they had they had to hire a focus group to come up with the name for this boat. They couldn't call it an Alaskan, right? I mean, they gave the Alaskan to Tony. And he's calling it a Fleming. So they had to come up with another name. So they hired this focus group. The focus group, a synonym for Alaska is Aleutian. There you go. Now, the Aleutian, I have to admit, Bob was right in some of the ways. The people who were interested in a Hatteras bought Aleutians. The largest Aleutian they made was 72. A lot of Hatterases in the hundreds, over 100 feet. Okay. So 72 is a large Hatteras, but not a big Hatteras. So the Hatteras buyer could be coaxed into an illusion, but you would never see a Hatteras buyer buying a quality design such as Fleming did. They don't do that. The real yachting people on the East Coast and West Coast, who are small boat sailors, cruisers, they're the ones that want this kind of style and this kind of quality, and that's the people who buy the Flemings that had originally bought the Alaskans. And they did well selling the Aleutians, but they didn't do as well as Tony Fleming's doing with the Fleming. They didn't beat Tony. Tony defeated them. He defeated them because he had the 55, and then he built a 75, and then he began building a 65. So he has 3 basic models. 55, 65, and 75. And it's all in this book, right here. The story about how it happened, why it happened, and how successful it was, and the story of Tony's life as an engineer, as a traveler, and throughout this book he talks about his travels and where he goes, and he's constantly going on cruises. If he can't go on his own boat, he'll go take a passage on a ship. He'll go down to Antarctica, and he'll go down to, go around Cape Horn. He goes up to, the Arctic Circle. I mean, this guy really, he's like you. You like that?
Yes.
Okay, so anybody have any questions? Yes.
I don't have a question, I have a comment. We have a Sabre 36, built in
Right.
89 first year, and many people say, oh, it's a Grand Banks. It's not a Grand Banks, it's a Sabre.
Yes, your boat has got a hull like this.
The plain hull.
Your boat has a hunt hull.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a plane.
It's a plain hull.
Yeah,
It's a hunt.
okay. Yeah,
The fact that it planes is a characteristic. The only boat that Sabre in their history paid a royalty for on the design, one boat, and that's your boat.
and ours was early one, first one built, 89.
Very comfortable boat.
Oh, it is,
Okay. Yeah.
but many people go.
And
oh,
what
it's-
engines do you have in that boat?
Detroit's. The first couple of years they had Detroit's.
Has Detroit's?
Yeah,
Yeah.
You still have them?
oh, yeah.
How many hours are on that boat?
25. How many hours on it?
Just 2,500?
Yeah.
So which Detroits do you have?
8.2.
Oh, that particular engine.
Yeah, it's a 4-stroke engine, not the 2-stroke.
Right. Yeah, that'll be all right.
Yeah.
As long as I get parts.
Yeah, but this East Bay
Okay.
is very closely related to your hull. That boat was called the Fast Trawler.
Yes, it's a fast car.
It's the only one they made.
So when we go to boat shows, we look at the newer ones and we like ours because it's got the fly bridge and it's a good size for us.
Looks like that.
Yeah, looks like
Looks
it's.
like that, except.
Basically, Grand Banks wanted to take this
Yeah.
and put it on this. But guess what? Sabre found out, and they did. That's what happened. Yeah.
Were you over at Oxford Boatyard?
Yeah, right.
About 15 years ago.
Pardon?
About 15 years ago, were you at Oxford Boatyard? Because that's where we found this boat.
More like 30.
Yeah, okay. We found one there, and it wasn't.
40.
Some issues with it, so, but that's how we got.
At least 35 years.
Okay.
We got this one down in Solomon's. They've been under a cover. So it was,
Keep it undercover.
uh,
And unfortunately,
yeah,
that's
we
the
can't
case.
afford it. It sits at our dock.
Huh?
It sits at our dock.
Then get a cover for it. Put it on the boat. Cheapest thing you ever did. It will last, make the boat last forever. You can go in, just, there are companies in Maine that make beautiful covers for those boats. They'll last 25, 30 years.
That was my own comment.
Are East Bay or Grand Banks still in business?
Pardon?
Are East Bay or Grand Banks still in business? Are they still making?
Well, Grand Banks is a publicly traded company.
Okay, still exists.
But, and what they did is they bought Palm Beach. And they're building Palm Beaches.
So there's no more Grand Banks brand?
Well, at the moment, they're not, well, they build a Palm Beach and put a Grand Banks label on it.
Yeah, okay.
But that's not that. And that Palm Beach isn't that.
When did the hull go from wood? There was the really, really old, those were wood hulls.
They were built out of wood in the 60s.
Okay, I didn't know when this,
I sold the last wooden Grand Banks new and the first fiberglass boat. First fiberglass boat they built, I sold. The last boat made of wood, I sold. That was the first boat that I sold, was the deal.
when was it?
1972. It was a wooden Grand Banks 32. So there you go.
John, one comment on Fleming. On YouTube, you can find some of his traveling adventures on his boat. It's a series, I think. I haven't followed it, but I've seen him in the boat. I think he's doing it 65 in Alaska.
Fleming is interesting because not only did he have the engineering skills, but he was a boating person. He became a boating person. He became a boating person when he was first in Hong Kong. It's all in the book. And he talks about sailing a 505 in Hong Kong Harbor at the Hong Kong Yacht Club. He was a 505 sailor. Imagine. Tony had a real sailing background. He learned it. I mean, he wasn't what you call a great 505 sailor, but he did it. But he's still a sailing person. Livingston wasn't. There was what lacked there. What happened? You see, what happened that day with Mitch Neff was that Bob Livingston didn't have the sailing or boating culture to the level that he could understand this design. Because you and I both know that a perfect S&S design, people fall in love with. It's just, that's just the essence of it all. And that's what Mitch gave them. But they couldn't bring themselves to build it.
Has it ever been built?
That design, no. Well, you see, there's another reason why it wasn't built. Now I'll tell you what that is. And there's this, the reason why this boat was successful and why Grand Banks bought Palm Beach. Yes. When this boat was conceived, when this day came, when this boat was going to be on top of this boat, these people wanted this hull so they could put this on top of that. Well, Hunt wanted money for this shape. Bob wouldn't pay them. He wouldn't pay them a nickel because he didn't think it would work. So what they did, under pressure, relented to the marketing department and agreed to pay Hunt a royalty, a classic naval architecture royalty agreement for the East Bay line. And for that, Hunt would give them all the designs and engineering to the minute detail. So Bob went along with it. This is a company, this is a CEO now who's got $40 million US in the bank and no debt. And he made that kind of decision. Guess what happened? 500 boats happened. And guess what the royalties added up to astronomical. So, what did Grand Banks do? They buy Palm Beach and hire the CEO to be their CEO. And they don't have to pay any more royalties. But guess what happened? The people who are attracted to the hunt culture are the same people who get attracted to the Sparkman and Stevens culture. They didn't sell Palm Beaches to that group. They're selling Palm Beaches to the more Nugo rich group. So they have this big chasm in the market where they, in order to survive, they did this, and they knew what was going to happen. But he was so tight that he couldn't pay any more royalties to these people. That's the truth.
Thank you, John.
Huh?
Thank you, John.
How you know? That's video, it's not for publication, right?
I'll give you a call about Grand Banks.
Yeah, I'll do what I can. Thanks for bringing it, Polly. It's good fun. Yes, sir.
There's a Fleming made in Annapolis.
There's a dealer in Annapolis named Art Burr. The Flemings are made in Taiwan. Well, no, but really, this is